again. Well done. You've been learning a lot about climate science and are well on your way to carbon literacy. This is the last of the science forward lessons to establish our shared foundational truths around a warming planet and the resulting climate change. Now that you're familiar with some terminology and better understand our goal of net zero by 2050, in this lesson, we're going to take a closer look at emissions with four different key points. Why it matters when we start taking action to reduce emissions, the different emission costs for things we buy and actions we take to reinforce the importance of calculating emissions. We'll review how emissions are categorized and allocated in terms of scopes. Then we'll share some of the strategic frameworks that already exist for setting baselines and plans for emission reductions. And throughout, we'll point out how this overlaps or aligns with the industry of international education. First, what do the path to net zero look like? As we know, it's not just about the end goal of net zero, but it's also about the level of emissions we're pumping into the atmosphere between now and 2050 and its effect on humankind. And the slower we are to act, the harder it will be to meet the goal. So, how we get to net zero matters too. In keeping with the Race to Zero campaign and using 2019 as our last normal year pre-COVID, we overlaid two possible scenarios for emission reduction. Here we see a stylized version of different paths to net zero, with the color under the line representing the total emissions that are going into the atmosphere. This first graph ascribes the strategy a little bit more aggressive than the Race to Zero strategy. The reduction of emission is drastic, which means less impact on the climate and greater ability to meet the science-based targets. There are a number of benefits to our organizations and communities through this first strategy. Most obviously, fewer emissions hanging around the atmosphere for hundreds of years. The second path is one of resistance to change. You can see that while the end goal is the same as the previous graph, in this scenario, we kick the can down the road, push off any meaningful action, and end up with much more emissions out in the atmosphere. This resistance comes from a number of places, including systemic change from slow-moving governments and organizations, as well as individuals who want to take action but struggle with not knowing how, feeling alone, and possibly suffering from climate anxiety. We will address some of these barriers in future chapters. But regardless of why, action is not being taken with the urgency required when faced with a crisis. And with this resistance, we are set to generate more emissions now, and we are placing the burden of change on the next generation. Until now, this has been the path that the sector of international education has taken. We have had limited awareness on the intersection of climate justice and international education, and the frameworks and schemes we use don't always count all the emissions related to our work. We will explain this further in a minute. Our current rate of emissions reduction essentially implies that we leave emission reduction to the next generation, or it doesn't happen at all. Both of those paths are less healthy and sustainable option for everyone. But now, especially as you work your way through this course, you continue to be better equipped with the knowledge, language, and tools to alter this path. We are about to discuss counting emissions, a key method for changing our emission reduction path to the first option, where we take on the work now rather than save it for later. We have effective methods of making systemic change, which we will cover in later chapters. Counting emissions is just our first tool. Collectively, these tools will help us see a clear path forward for taking action. So let's talk about counting emissions. You might be familiar with the term carbon footprint. It's a well-known term, but we are not going to use it in this course. Instead, we'll say total emissions, or refer to emissions impact of activities or operations. We'll dig into why we're not using the term carbon footprint in chapter 4. But for now, the important thing to understand about conceptualizing our emissions is that it's important to be carbon literate. Being carbon literate means we understand the emissions we are counting and how we're counting them as we aim to reduce the emissions impact of our work. So we'll start with understanding that not all actions have the same emissions impact or carbon impact. Then we'll get into how emissions are categorized when we count them. We're going to take a moment to understand the different carbon costs and impact of various things we buy and actions that we take to reduce our carbon impact. Let's start with the carbon costs of things we are familiar with. We all know there's a carbon impact for paper. Some of our offices have gone paperless, and some of us don't print a ton anymore, or do so much less than before. A 2012 study in the Journal of Cleaner Production estimated that office paper, from cradle to customer, produces from 4.29 gram to 4.74 gram of CO2 equivalent per sheet of A4 paper, meaning a pack of paper with 500 sheets has a carbon cost of 2.15 kilograms to 2.37 kilograms. We also do some shopping, and there is a carbon cost associated with consuming products and clothing. For example, a pair of jeans is estimated to have a carbon cost of 33 kilos to 80 kilos of CO2. And an iPhone 14 Pro is estimated to average a little over 80 kilos of CO2 during the production process, and decreasing with every model. And we've all heard a lot about the impact of our diet, so let's look at that for a moment. For the average US diet, estimates range from 2.45 kilos of CO2 to 4.72 kilos of CO2 per day, according to different estimates for a range of 895 kilos per year to 1.7 tons of CO2 per year. While one study in the UK estimates ranges from 2.9 kilos per day for vegans to 5.6 kilos for medium meat eaters and 7.2 kilos for high meat eaters. That's around 1 ton, 2 tons, and 2.6 tons per year, respectively. Notably, the study pointed out that going vegan from the medium meat eaters, when extrapolated outwards, saves about 1 ton. As for transportation, distance is often the highest contributing factor to the total emissions cost, but you can get a sense of the different impact of various transportation methods. And traveling has different emissions impact per kilometer as well. The US EPA has emission factors for travel by car of 194 gram of CO2 emissions per kilometer traveled, or 313 grams per mile. And travel by bus comes in at 33 grams of CO2 per kilometers, or 55 grams per mile. While Eurostar trains have an emission factor of 5.5 grams per kilometer traveled. For comparison, a one-way flight from London Heathrow to Toronto Pearson is equal to 1.2 tons of CO2 for atmosphere's emissions offsetting tool. Based on this, you can start to process how different actions, both individual at home and within our work, have very different emissions intensity, and that efforts for reduction of emissions must include counting those emissions to understand where to have the biggest impact. Okay, now it's clearer than ever we must measure emissions. But which emissions are we counting in our work, and how are they categorized? Good question. The scientific community has identified and categorized the sources of emissions into 3 scopes. Each scope identifies the source of emissions and its correlation to the level of influence on the total emissions from that source. This is also the same terminology your sustainability offices or committees will be familiar with. Essentially, Scope 1 is direct emissions that are owned or controlled by a company, for example, buildings or company-owned vehicles. Scope 2 is indirect emissions associated with the purchased energy consumed by the company. Consider electricity, steam, heat, or cooling. And Scope 3 is emissions that are a consequence of the organization's activities, but occur from sources not owned or controlled by the organization, such as employees' commute to work, purchased goods, shipping, and business travel. And here, in Scope 3, is where most of the emissions from international education operations will sit, which is noteworthy, an opportunity for our sector because most institutional sustainability plans to date do not include measuring emissions from Scope 3. There you have it. We now know how to categorize emissions, and this helps us better understand the influence and power we have to take action and reduce emissions. As mentioned in the previous lesson, reducing emissions from your organization's baseline in the first part of attaining net zero. Establishing an emissions baseline or running emissions inventories requires some time and resources, to define where accounting and how, but it provides a starting point from which we can measure, plan, and strategize to meet the targets and goals for emissions reduction. Now, the good news is there are a number of internationally and regionally recognized or accepted frameworks or schemes that help guide organizations to set baselines, targets, and goals to reach net zero. And some of them even look specifically at education institutions. We will briefly mention several of these now, and you can find links in the lesson description to take a closer look at the frameworks to determine if they might be useful for your office or institution. First, we have initiatives that bring together all kinds of organizations. The UNFCCC's Race to Zero campaign, United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, is the world's largest coalition of non-state actors, including companies, cities, regions, financial, educational, and healthcare institutions. Members commit to take urgent and immediate action to address the climate crisis. Then we have frameworks specifically for education. This includes the SDGs Accord, which is more focused on peer learning and doesn't require measuring emissions, and the Sustainability Tracking, Assessment, and Rating System, aka STARS, by AASHE, the Association for the Advancement of Sustainability in Higher Education. STARS goes an extra step by incorporating Scope 3 emissions into its self-reporting framework, which is hugely important because it holds institutions accountable for high-intensity emission activities, including business travel. And last but not least, our great friends at CANI, the Climate Action Network for International Educators. The CANI Accord is the only global framework which is specific to international education. Signatories who sign the CANI Accord make a number of commitments. This set of commitments was designed specifically for any institution, organization, or company in our sector. Admittedly, we're biased with TJ having been a founding member of CANI, serving as the inaugural VP of the Global Board, and helping bring the CANI Accord to life. And a number of Aletheia members are active members of CANI and are in leadership positions. But its principles and structure were developed by experts in the field with input from many sectors leaders. It truly is a framework that is specific to our wonderful world of international education and provides an inclusive way for entry into climate action. It's scalable for organizations of all types and sizes and was made for international educators by international educators. We encourage you to familiarize yourself with the CANI Accord today. Thanks for sticking with me. I know that was a lot. The takeaway here is that the path we take to achieve net zero matters because emissions are warming our planet and changing our climate. But also, there are resources in education and international education specifically that can support you in setting baselines, counting emissions, and aligning with strategic frameworks and schemes for your organization to succeed in taking climate action that meets the urgency of the moment. In the next chapter, we will look at how climate change affects our colleagues and the students they serve. You will hear from members of Aletheia Global Knowledge Collective who will share the research and findings, and we'll start to talk about and digest feelings around the work of climate change, which is very real and very important to address.